Well, welcome. On behalf of Wesley Seminary, I would like to welcome you and thank you for joining us today for 10 small tweaks for big preaching impact with Dr. Lenny Luchetti. We've got a treat for you today. This event, as you know, is part of the Wesley Seminary Webinar Series with the goal of resourcing the local church. And in fact, we'd like to give a quick shout out today as we get started to Pastor Steve Dunmeyer and his pastoral staff at Watermark Wesleyan Church as they are gathered together today as a staff using this as a training opportunity. And we're so thankful for that. That was the goal of these webinars. And we hope that more of you will take advantage of these opportunities to do so in the future. So thank you so much for doing that. So as I said, today we've got Dr. Lenny Luchetti with us. If you have any questions during his presentation, please enter those in the Q&A forum, and he will answer as many as he can after his presentation today. Dr. Lenny Luchetti is known as an insightful professor with a pastor's heart. He brings more than 25 years of ministry experience to his present role as professor of proclamation and Christian ministries at Wesley Seminary. Before joining the faculty, Lenny has served as a lead pastor in a small church that had a significant turnaround and grew into a large, multi-ethnic, intergenerational, economically diverse, and community impacting church during his tenure. He is now responsible primarily for the development and teaching of the doctoral and master's level preaching courses here at Wesley Seminary. Lenny is a popular speaker at camps, colleges, and churches, and he also serves on the editorial board for Christianity Today's Preaching Today resource. Dr. Luchetti received his bachelor's degree from Houghton College and his MDiv and DMin from Asbury Theological Seminary. Lenny has been married to Amy, his partner in life and ministry, since 1998, and they enjoy life and laughter with their teenage children, Zach, Leah, and Sam. His hobbies include fly fishing, racquetball, and running. So it is my distinct pleasure today to welcome Dr. Lenny Luchetti.
Thanks, Joel, for that introduction, and thank you for joining us. I know you're busy. Your lives are definitely full. And so thanks for honoring us with your presence as we seek to honor Jesus and talk about how to better proclaim Jesus, to make a big deal of Jesus so that people connect with him for eternity. That's the goal. So I want to talk about some tiny tweaks, small tweaks for big preaching impact. Sometimes it's just a small change, a small adjustment, a small tweak that can have a big impact in some way. There was a point in my early 20s where I hit a golfing wall. I started golfing maybe 18, 19 years old. I actually took a community college class in golfing. And I was pretty good for a beginner. And then in my early 20s, I just hit a wall. And I was on the course with my friend. We were heading to the first tee. And there were three women in their 70s also heading to the first tee, but because we were in our 20s, we beat them to the tee. And so we got to play first. And so I did my 10 practice swings, stepped up to address the ball, and then swung as hard as I could, trying to show off in front of these women. And actually, my golf club, my driver, topped the ball, and the ball dribbled maybe 5 yards in front of me. And one of the women said, "Go ahead and hit another, Sonny. No, take a mulligan." I said, "Thanks." Put another ball on the tee and again, swung as hard as I could, crushed it this time, made good contact, hit the ball about 300 yards, 100 yards straight, 200 yards, sliced to the right into the woods. I turned back to the women and said, it's going to be a long day for me. Why don't you play through? You go first. Each of those women in their 70s, without even taking a practice swing, stepped up to the tee, hit the ball straight as an arrow right up the middle of the fairway, about 225 yards. When they were walking away, I could see their heads bobbing with laughter at me, those rascals. Well, I thought to myself, enough is enough. I'm gonna go out with my golf mentor, a gentleman in the church named Rich, and get some pointers. And so I did. I said, I'm getting worse, not better in golf. Please feel free to give me some pointers. And he said, "Let me see your grip." And I showed him my grip, and he said, if you just turn your right hand about an inch to the left in your grip, I think it'll help your swing. And that tiny tweak actually had a huge impact on my golf game. I didn't become a Tiger Woods, but it knocked several strokes off my game. I got better. So what I want to talk about today is some tweaks we can make to our preaching. When we hit a wall in preaching, it might not necessitate an overhaul of our preaching, right? That we just sort of start all over and totally revamp our preaching. That might be necessary, but it might just be a few small tweaks to our preaching that could get us out of the woods and on the fairway a little bit better, a little bit further. So I want to talk about some of those tweaks. The first one is prep in a pub. Prep in a pub. And what I mean by pub is public. Do sermon preparation in a public place. Change of place equals change in perspective. So write your entire sermon in a public place where real people with real issues live and move and have their being. Go to McDonald's at 11 o'clock and watch senior citizens who are lonely and many of them widowed try to find community. Go to a bar at midday, to a pub at midday, and see people drowning their sorrows in drink during the day. Go to a Starbucks. See real people with real issues. Write your sermon there. Christianity has never been ultimately about gathering. I know we do gather, but we gather so that we go. The incarnation is all about a God who came onto our campus, onto our turf. And incarnational ministry then means going off campus onto the turf of another so that we can see people where they are, where they live and move and have their being. So, when I'm in my study at the church in the safety of the church campus, writing my sermon in my cloistered little office, I have a tendency to offer overly simplistic answers to complex questions. When I'm in my office by myself, I tend to think that people feel what I feel on every given issue. But when I prep in a public place, I'm immersed. It's almost like osmosis with real people, with real issues. So it causes me to wonder empathically what they're thinking and feeling, or what they might think and feel on the text I'm about to preach this coming Sunday. So if I'm in Starbucks, I'm wondering, as I'm preparing the sermon, how will that gay barista hear this good news I'm going to preach? How will that homeless guy begging outside of the Starbucks hear this text? How will that 17-year-old girl with purple hair and black lipstick ordering the latte hear the good news? Change of place gives you change in perspective. Prep in a pub, a public place. The second tweak is aim for substance and relevance. Now, this may seem like a duh to you, like, of course. Early on in my preaching, I was way more concerned about relevance than I was substance. And maybe you're more focused on substance than relevance. We need both, right? We need theological substance and contextual relevance in every sermon we preach. And there's a way to do that intentionally. Every good sermon should be like Jesus, full of divinity and humanity, substance and relevance, faithful to God and the biblical text, fitting to the contemporary context, divine and human, right? So how do we do that? Let's talk about how to aim for theological substance so that what we have to say is worth saying. When I sort of got the sense that I was really more concerned with relevance than substance, and I needed to make sure I had something to say, I started to intentionally ask myself these questions. Sorry for all the text, but I asked these questions. Now I do it more intuitively, but I had to do it intentionally back then. Questions I would ask as I was writing the sermon. Does this sermon say anything of substance about God? Can the sermon be applied without reliance on God? Or is it humanistic? Sometimes sermons are full of good advice that people can get from a talk show, right? About dating or marriage or finances. But from the Christian preacher, they must get not just good advice, they must get God, right? So we have to call them to rely upon and relate to God. Another question that haunts me all the time is, what might someone conclude about God based upon my sermon? I confess that in my first few years of preaching, I was more concerned with what people would think of me because of my preaching. Now, what haunts me is, what will people think of God because of my preaching? Then another question is, what Christian doctrine is explicit or implicit in this particular sermon? So I want to make sure that the sermon has some substance to it. And then I also want to make sure, though, that the sermon has relevance. Because the sermon is not just a Bible study about the long, long ago in a faraway place. It's not just about the then and there of the biblical text. A sermon is about the here and now of the context. You'll notice, if you remember from psychology class, this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I think it's a good grid as we prepare the sermon to make sure that what we're going to say from Scripture addresses some human need or needs. And by the way, Jesus met needs at every level. He met human needs. He met physiological needs. He fed the hungry. He met safety needs. He addressed safety needs. So the woman who was being stoned to death because she was caught in adultery, he protected her. He met the human need for love and belonging. So when he cleansed the leper, he sent the leper back to community, to love and belonging. He addressed esteem needs. So he called Simon Peter rock long before Simon was acting like a rock. He saw something in Peter that Peter didn't see in Peter, and he called Peter to something better, esteem. And then self-actualization. So where Jesus sends out the disciples 2 by 2 on a mission trip, empowers them to go. Jesus addresses needs at every level. The most vibrant churches address human need at every level, and the Christian sermon will address human needs as well. When I was doing my doctoral studies, I went on a trip to Seoul, South Korea, and was able to accompany a Korean pastor on a home visit. Had a translator with me, of course. And so this pastor in his 20s sat on the floor across from a woman in her 70s, maybe early 80s. I don't know how she sat on the floor, but remarkably she did. And he asked her what was going on in her life. And for about 5 minutes, she shared her prayer requests, her struggles, her joys, her needs. And after listening to her need, that pastor preached a 5-minute homily addressing her need through the Word of God. What a great image for me of how to hear and respond to human need through the sermon. All right, next week. Take a crazy creative risk monthly. Do something you've never done before in your preaching. Boldly go where you've never gone before. I remember some of the risks I've taken. This may not seem all that risky to you. It was to me, but I remember preaching a sermon titled M&M, Ministry and Mission. And during the sermon, I threw little packs of M&Ms out at the congregation. I was always throwing things at my people. It's a wonder they came to church. I remember Frank Kresge, one of the older guys in the church, about 90 years old and bald, but he had one hair sticking up, and the M&Ms went right over his head, hit that one hair. He never even saw it. I remember one time preaching on God as the potter and we are the clay, and a woman at her pottery wheel was doing her thing behind me while I was preaching, and she actually made a communion chalice and dish. One time I was preaching a series called The Story That Shapes Us, trying to capture the meta-narrative of the Bible in 5 sermons. And each week, a woman was a painter, was painting on the canvas while I was preaching. For you, the risk might be preaching a book of the Bible from memory. It might be doing a first-person sermon. It might be going up to the pulpit or the music stand or whatever with no notes It might be for you, the risk might be typing a full manuscript and preaching from it. Just do something you've not done before so that you stay fresh and creative in your preaching. Now, creative risks can be costly. They can backfire. Like it happened for me when I was preaching a sermon called God's Lost and Found Bin. I took the church's Lost and Found bin up to the platform, pulled out stuff that was in it, and one of those items was a hard plastic army truck. And as I pulled it out, one of the 10-year-old kid in about a quarter of the way from me down the aisle said, "Oh, can I have it?" And without even thinking, I threw the hard plastic army truck to him, and he turned to talk to his friend at the same time, and the truck came down, hit him right in the face, and that was the introduction to my sermon. It was a hard sermon to preach after that. So that creative risk backfired. But I think, in my reading of the parable of the talents, I think what Jesus is saying through that parable is, I would rather you take wholly calculated risks and fail than to never take risks at all. Take some kind of crazy creative risk monthly in your preaching. Another tweak is speak diverse love languages. Now, if you're a Christian who got engaged in the 90s, like I did, you probably read the book, The 5 Love Languages by Gary Chapman. Chapman makes a case that the breakdown in marriage is often the result of trying to love our spouse, not the way our spouse wants to be loved, but the way we want to be loved. So if I'm loving Amy, my wife, with words of affirmation because that's my love language, when her love language is actually quality time, I'm going to miss the boat. The key is to figure out what her love language is and to love her that way. Applied to preaching, we tend to naturally preach in ways that speak to us instead of in ways that speak to a diversity of people. We wrongly assume that all listeners access the sermon like we do. At least that's my assumption. And I need to get past that assumption because there's a diversity of listener love languages out there, and I want to speak to as many as I can, as often as I can. So how do you do that? Here are the at least four listener love languages as far as I can tell. Some people in your congregation listen with their heart for illustrative inspiration. They want chicken soup for the soul. They love anecdotes. They're the only people who can't get enough of the preacher's personal stories about marriage and parenting. All right. So when you tell a funny story, they're leaning in and laughing. When you tell a sad story, they're weeping. Again, chicken soup for the soul. And then there are people who listen with their mind for exegetical information. They want you to dive deep into one biblical text. No word study is too exhaustive. No historical background is irrelevant. These are the people who care about what happened to the Jebusites. Like they care. And so when you get into the exegetical weeds, they're leaning in, taking notes. When you start telling personal illustrations, they're checking out. They're backing off. Some people listen with their soul for theological reflection. They're slightly different from the mind people because they don't want you to dig deep into one biblical text. They want you to offer sort of a biblical theological long view on a given issue or doctrine. These are people who refuse to accept simple answers to complex questions. They want sermons titled like Implications of the Incarnation or Trinity as a Model for Community, or Why Bad Things Happen in a World That a Good, Powerful, Loving God Created. They want you to look at social issues from various theological vantage points. Okay. And then there are people who listen with their hands or their strength for practical application. They just want to know how to live for God on Monday. Just tell me what to do on Monday. How can I manage my time better? How can I maintain my ethical commitments in a workplace where my supervisor is asking me to lie and steal and cheat? So what can I do? How do I manage my life well tomorrow. So how do you speak to all these love languages? Well, one of the things you can do is use this as a sermon form, as a sermon outline. Heart, mind, soul, strength. So start with an illustrative story, get at the heart of an issue, and then dig into the text, exegetical information, and then go into soul reflection on the issue, and then end with practical application, which is a good sermon flow. I call it the Shema sermon form. Love the Lord with your heart, mind, soul, strength. It's a great form. The other thing you might want to do is just next time you type out a full manuscript, if you do that, for every paragraph, go through it and write whether or not it hits at the heart, the mind, the soul, the strength for each paragraph, and then see what you have too much of and what you're missing. All right, next week, and this is an important one. They're all important, but this is really an important one. It's a game changer for some preachers. Employ the 25% rule. Before I say what the rule is, let me just say a few things to set it up. When we listen, while we're preaching, when we listen to listeners with our eyes, when we're in the moment with them watch us, and seeing their responses, there's mirror neurons in our brain that are firing and giving us the capacity to empathize with what they're thinking and feeling in the moment they're thinking and feeling it. And if we're really in the moment with our people, more into our people than our paper, our notes, we're empathically adjusting what we're saying and how we're saying it in the moment we're saying it without even realizing it. So I'm not talking about the eloquence of eye contact. I'm actually talking about the eloquence of empathy, an empathic connection between preacher and people that comes through the eyes, basically. So what I'm commending is employ the 25% rule. What I mean by that is devote 25% of your overall sermon preparation time to internalizing, memorizing, practicing, praying for the delivery. Preaching is not a written event. It's an oral event, which makes me wonder why so many people take all their time to write it and very little time, if any, devoted to preparing to deliver it. Good content with poor delivery diminishes the content. People won't hear it. People pick up on how you're delivering it, not just what you're saying. So if you have 10 hours to prepare, write the thing in 7.5, spend 2.5 hours getting it in you, internalizing it, practicing, memorizing, so that when you stand up to preach, you can be more into your people than into your paper. And there's a bond created there. I would spend 2 hours on Saturday morning, 2 hours on Sunday morning getting the sermon in me, so that I can get up and look at them preach their sermon back to me with their body, their eyes, their face. 25% rule. All right. Next week, experiment with a variety of sermon forms. We're going to have some Q&A in a bit too. Just want to let you know. So throw your questions in the chat room, and we'll get to some of those later. Because I want to scratch where you itch. So go ahead and throw those questions out. So experiment with a variety of sermon forms. It's so easy for the preacher when we have one or two forms that we use to become bored. And our people find our preaching predictable if we're just using one form. Think of sermon structuring, sermon forming, sermon outlining, whatever you want to call it, sermon flow, as more like the baking of bread than the baking of brownies. So when you have a brownie recipe, it doesn't matter when you throw the ingredients in, the eggs, the oil, the chocolate chips, the butter. You can throw them in anytime. It doesn't matter to the recipe. Sermon forming is more like bread baking. When you add the ingredients matters. So you have to add the flour first, and then you have to add the yeast, and then the salt, and then the spice. And we structure the sermon not just for the sake of our recall, but for the sake of listener experience, for the flow, for them, the emotional flow of the sermon. So this is a basic linear form. Many of us have used this. Probably all of us have used this form. We state the bottom line of the sermon, and then we prove it with 3 points. Point 1, exposition, illustration, application. Point 2, same thing. And this sermon form works, but the problem is, for some preachers, it's the only form they use, and it's boring to them and it's predictable to the flock. What's odd to me is that while so many sermons use this form, the Bible speaks mostly through this form, through narrative, setting, problem, climax, resolution. So you don't have to just preach a point-based sermon. You can preach a plot-based sermon and mix it up a little bit. There are so many ways to structure a sermon. Here are just a few more. The sky's the limit, really. You could preach a Charlie Chaplin sermon. That if you've been around a while, you know that Charlie Chaplin was a silent comic. So try to preach a silent sermon. I don't know how you'll do it. When you figure it out, let me know. But maybe there's a way. Save the best for last, where the whole sermon is creating tension and ambiguity and angst. And then at the very end, you relieve the tension with the good news of God's grace in the Bible. Team up and preach a sermon. I remember on Father's Day, I preached with 2 other pastors on staff, 10 minutes each. You might preach a string of quotes. I remember walking into one of the churches I served and was met at the door by someone who told me that his 21-year-old bipolar son went to jail the night before. Further into the church I encountered someone else who told me that his wife in her 40s was just diagnosed with a heart defect that would significantly diminish her lifespan. So anyway, I decided the sermon I had to preach had to get chucked and thrown to the side. And I just got up and from memory shared scripture verses of comfort for the people. It was a short sermon, 10, 12 minutes of scripture, but it was what we needed. So there's just different ways. Talkback sermons where you preach for a little bit and then have Q&A on that topic. First person sermons where you are a character in the text. Just a variety of ways to form sermons. All right. Another tweak, change position to signal transition. When I first started out preaching, I was a senior in college and I was a nervous wreck. And so I would pace like a caged lion back and forth on the platform, just nervous energy, nothing intentional about my movement at all. Caged lion, back and forth, back and forth. It wasn't the kindest to my congregation. So how can we use our movement in strategic ways to signal a transition in the sermon? So for example, if we're doing a comparison, we're talking about what's going on in the Bible, we come over on this side of the platform. And then we talk about how it relates in a relevant way to our contemporary context. Or we might be comparing Judas's response to disappointment. We come over here, and then we compare it to Peter's response to disappointment. Comparing the Pharisees to Jesus or Goliath to David. And whenever we weave in and out of those comparisons, we just change our position to signal transition. Now, if you're a pulpit preacher, just turn your body, turn your torso, and just signal transition. Because what you do with your body helps people track with your words. It might be a digression and progression sort of movement. So let's say you're trying to preach on the incarnation of Christ. And you might start out far from the people, way back here, creation. Then God gave us the law. Then he sent the prophets. And then you come on the floor with your people and then talk about how God came to us as one of us to save us because he loves us, incarnation. So when your body is going where your content is heading, people can track. Let your people help you preach. Listen, I'm a seminary professor who teaches preaching. I believe in the seminary and seminary education. But no course, no professor can help you preach quite like your people can. If you let them. So let your people help you preach. Two ways to do this. One is get input from your people before you preach. Get input from your people before you preach. I knew a pastor in Houston who every Tuesday would preach his sermon to his elders, and they would give him insight, question, help him make some modifications before he preached it on Sunday. I would read my preaching text in my staff meeting, a pretty diverse staff at one point, and they would ask questions, make observations that shaped what I preached that coming Sunday. Another thing you might do is use a sermon input survey where you ask people about what books from the Bible they'd like to study. Maybe give them pick 2 books from the Bible, pick 2 Christian doctrines you'd like to study, pick 2 topics you'd like to study: parenting, marriage, finances, whatever, social issues, and then let someone in your congregation gather the data and then preach on those topics that your people want to hear about. So get input before you preach. Another way, and this is scary to some of us, right, is get feedback after you preach. One way to do this is with a focus group. So gather 7 to 10 people that represent a cross-section of your congregation, young and old and middle-aged, black, white, brown, yellow, educated, uneducated, various socioeconomic levels, various levels of spiritual maturity. And when you go, do this for 3 weeks. Buy them lunch. And then don't ask them if they like the sermon. Just ask questions like, where did you most encounter God in this sermon? When were you least engaged in the sermon? If you could sum up the sermon in a sentence, what would you say? How will you live differently tomorrow based upon what you heard today? So there's just a couple questions you might ask, and you'll discover a lot of insight. Your people will give you feedback that way. Another thing you can do is a sermon evaluation survey that you give to the entire church, maybe on a Sunday morning, hard copy it, or a Survey Monkey, which doesn't work as well. But and get some demographic information, make it anonymous, and then ask these 3 questions. 3 questions. Name a recent sermon that had a significant impact on you. Secondly, what do you appreciate most about the preaching in this church? And third, what's one thing you would change about the preaching in this church? And your people will tell you. If you let them, they will help you preach. I remember a guy in my church, a guy named Mike, said to me one day after a sermon, "My wife loves all of your sports illustrations, Pastor." He was being sarcastic. He was trying to tell me something. But I wish I had more of an intentional plan to receive feedback and input from my congregation. So let your people help you preach, and they will. They're talking about your preaching anyway. Might as well hear from them. Another tweak is concretize concepts. Sometimes when we preach, we're talking way up here. A lot of what we talk about in Christianity is ethereal, sort of esoteric, mumbo jumbo, real conceptual, and conceptual ideas don't stick like concrete images. And if you can attach a concrete image to a conceptual idea, people won't be scratching their heads wondering what in the world you're saying. Now, some of you are in congregations where they can listen conceptually, they're sophisticated. But even in those congregations, I guarantee you there are more concrete thinkers, and you don't want to miss them. Jesus did this all the time. He attached to every conceptual idea a concrete image. So when he was talking about the kingdom of God, a conceptual idea, he attached an image. The kingdom of God is like a treasure hidden in a field. The kingdom of God, conceptual image or conceptual idea, is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. Concrete image. A grain of mustard seed, leaven, a sower who went out to sow seed is like the kingdom of God. So, I mean, you can say bitterness is bad for your soul, or you can say bitterness is like drinking poison, expecting the other person to die. Try to attach a concrete image to a conceptual idea. Now, you might do this by using the prevailing metaphor or image through the entire sermon. It can be a powerful device, especially if that image or metaphor connects tightly to your sermon focus, your main point, your big idea. So one time I was trying to capture, God's grace, and the concrete image I attached to it was the golf mulligan. And go back to golf again, the golf mulligan. I was trying to preach about how we sometimes experience sort of apathy or acedia in our spiritual walk. We don't care to read the Bible or pray. What do? So I connected that to the baseball slump and tried to connect it that way and draw some insight from it. So all that to say, concretize concepts when you can. The best preachers use not just words we can hear, but words we can see with our mind's eye. So we don't just want creativity, we want clarity. And one of the ways we bring clarity of focus to our sermon is to make a memorable mantra, refrain, a phrase, a saying that we repeat strategically throughout the sermon. Not redundantly, but strategically. In academic writing, we are told never to say the same thing the same way twice. But when it comes to oral communication, strategic repetition can be a powerful device. Martin Luther King Jr. was a master of this, right? I have a dream. I have a dream. I have a dream. A strategic repetition. Andy Stanley does this a lot, where he will repeat some strategic quote, sentence throughout his sermon. I remember a sermon he preached 15 years ago. I heard the sermon, and it was on Romans 13 about submitting to authority. And about 5 or 6 times during the sermon, Andy Stanley said, if someone tells you what to do, the question is not what, but who. If someone tells you what to do, the question is not what, but who. It can be a powerful device in bringing clarity of focus to the sermon for your people, so that when they leave, they don't scratch their heads wondering what in the world the sermon was about. Make a memorable mantra. I'm giving you actually 12. I'm going to give you 2 more, and then we're going to have some Q&A. So this is an important one too. Create tension early in the sermon. If you don't make people itchy in the first 5 to 7 minutes of your sermon, itchy with the weight of the bad news, the tension, they might not stick around long enough to get the gospel scratch, the good news. Create tension early. Be as honest as you can be about the bad news, the angst, the problem in the plot of the text. Because the more people feel the tension of the bad news early in the sermon, the more they'll embrace the good news of God's grace when you get to it later. Imagine a movie that started with the happy ending. You know, all the mystery, the ambiguity, the plots, the twists, the turns, the surprises, all that's gone. You would shut it off after 10 minutes. And that's what people do in our preaching when we give them the bottom line resolution of the tension in the first 5 minutes. Why listen? So create tension early. Don't start the sermon like this. Today we're going to see that God always shows up to do miracles in our lives. Don't start that way. Start like this. You ever wonder if God is ever going to show up in that situation where you need him? Don't start the sermon. Today I want to tell you that God answers prayer. Start the sermon like this. Many of us have been praying prayers that have not been answered for decades. Don't start the sermon. You're never alone because God is with you. Start, have you ever felt loneliness so thick you could cut it with a knife? You get the idea. Create tension early, and people will stay with you for the resolution of the tension with the gospel later. Don't show all your cards, is what I'm saying. Last one, watch yourself. I hate watching myself preach on video. I mean, hate is a strong word, but that's how I just don't like it. I don't like it. And I always see things I wish I didn't, But the truth is, we communicate more non-verbally than verbally. those people aren't hearing just what our words are saying. They're actually hearing what our eyes, face, body are all saying. Also, watch yourself. Watch your face alignment with your words. My wife one time told me, she goes, Len, when you're preaching, you scowl a lot. I do this thing because I'm focused, And so I overcompensated and I started to smile too much. And so I remember one time watching myself on video, I was almost kind of smiling, not a big smile, but a smile, while saying something about a tsunami in Japan that killed thousands of people. I was smiling. Some people say, Jesus loves you, like this, So you want to make sure your face is congruent with your words. All of us, too, have annoying gestures that we won't pick up on unless we watch ourselves on video. I noticed at one point I was always playing with my wedding band, and I had to see myself do that to not do that anymore. I touch my nose, too much, like nervously. It can be annoying. I have this frenetic use of my hands sometimes. I'm Italian, so I talk with my hands and, bobble hands. So watch yourself, watch your annoying gestures, pick up on that. If you preach every week, maybe watch yourself monthly. It's painful, I know, but it's helpful, okay? So that's it. That's it from me. There's 12 tweaks. See, we gave you 2 bonus ones, 12 tweaks that can have big impact. Love to hear your thoughts, your questions. Hope that was helpful.
Great stuff, Dr. Luchetti. That was amazing. You had Star Trek and golf in one presentation. Kudos. And I got to see that scowl again. Can you give us a scowl one more time? I love it. I love it. Awesome. All right. Good stuff, man. Thank you. We've got some great questions on deck here, so I'll shut up and actually I'll keep talking and read the question, but then I'll shut up, I promise. Okay. Hey, Lenny, what's your best advice for reaching a broad spiritual audience? Going too deep versus not deep enough for people who don't know Jesus to people who have known Jesus most of their lives. Make sense?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we do have that diversity in terms of spiritual maturity. I'll say this as carefully as I can say it. Don't assume that length of time as a Christian equates to spiritual maturity. That is, somebody can be in the church a long time and not be really biblically mature, and someone can be a brand new Christian and be biblically mature. So, and I used to think that the longtime Christians wanted the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help them God, and that new Christians had to have it watered down, with spinach with a spoonful of sugar, and that's not the case. I think people want the truth. I do, and I think even among new believers, when we speak to the truth, they know they're more likely to hear the good news they hope for when we get to it in the sermon. So, and I think we live in a sort of a post-Christian, biblically illiterate context where we have to start again to teach the scriptures. I remember when in the church I pastored, we were, most of our growth, almost all of our growth came by way of conversion growth. So we had brand new Christians, not transfer, but conversion growth. And so I realized I had to start preaching in ways that offered catechesis, teaching of sort of basic Christian doctrine and tools for that. What I discovered is the longtime Christians who I thought would know that stuff often did not. So I think what I said about sermon forms is helpful as well. So how do you tell the old familiar story to longtime Christians in a new, fresh way? Sometimes it's mixing up your sermon form. Moving from that point-based sermon to that plot-based narrative sermon could help.
Okay.
I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, very much. Man, the questions are rising here. We've got quite a few. Okay. How can we tackle the issue of a quiet congregation that doesn't seem very reactive while we are preaching? How can we tackle that? A quiet congregation.
Well, if you're the pastor, you get to know the people. So if you're in the Midwest congregation, I've noticed that when I came from the Northeast, my church in Pennsylvania, they would talk back to me the whole sermon. I'd ask rhetorical questions, they'd answer them out loud, so it was that kind of church, whooping and hollering. And then when I came and preached in the Midwest, just much more reserved. And I think just knowing your context well, and it's not because they're not with you necessarily, it's just because of who they are in terms of their personality. And I think the longer you're at a place, depending on your preaching style, the more you can move that reserved congregation to be more expressive. But let people be who they are, and don't assume that you're bombing. You might be bombing, your sermon might stink, but it might not be the case. Like, you might be connecting, but they're more cerebral than expressive. And so just give them the liberty to be that way, and don't beat yourself up too bad about it.
All right. Lenny, I speak in different churches almost weekly, different theological perspectives too. Most of the time I'm there representing an organization and a specific subject matter, so we already have that connection. However, what are some tips to better connect with the audience in their context?
Yeah, I'd ask a lot of questions. So when I travel and speak at places I've not been, I have a sort of a ministry request form that asks questions like, describe the context in 10 words, and then I'll often have a conversation with the person about more specifics, like, what are some things I might avoid? What are some things I should do? What kind of preaching connects with them from your perspective? So I ask those questions. And you always want to respect the context, right? So there's always this wrestling match I have with, they invited me to speak, so they want Lenny Luchetti's style, but I also don't want my style to infringe too much upon their context. I want to respect their context. So for example, if I'm the kind of preacher who likes to pace around, but I'm going into a context where preaching behind the pulpit matters, I need to let the context dictate my style in some way. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Be sensitive. So if I'm going to a context where robes are worn, and I like to preach in a t-shirt and jeans, I'm going to respect the context. I don't want my personal style to get in the way of people hearing the message of God through me because I'm not respectful of their context. So the context should be the trump card, honestly, not our style.
Okay. And next question here kind of piggybacks on that. And this is from Steve Dunmeyer and the team at Watermark Wesleyan. Said they gave us a huge shout out when we mentioned their name. So are there any situational times to use different sermon forms? Is that based on context, content, or some other reason?
Yep. So great question, Steve. The way I think of the flow of the sermon development is after I've done my exegesis of the context and the text, I will often so write these down: focus, function, form, those 3 F's. Okay. So once I've done the work in the text and thought about how it intersected with my particular context, I'll write a focus statement. The focus is the 1-sentence declarative word from the Lord around which everything in the sermon will revolve. So first I get what the sermon will say, the focus, and then I get to the function. What is the purpose of this particular sermon? Is it to instruct, inform, educate? If so, then the form that works with that purpose, that function, might be a more linear, point-based form. If the function or purpose is to motivate, inspire, correct, then maybe the form that I use is more narrative, more plot-based than point-based. So I draw them in and then rebuke them, kind of draw them into the plot and then slap them in the face, and it's too late to get out because they're already sucked in. So focus, what the sermon will say, function, the purpose of the sermon, and then the form is dictated, I think, by the function, by the purpose. That makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. What 2 to 3 preaching books do you recommend the most?
Other than Preaching Essentials and Preaching with Empathy?
There we go.
Just kidding. No, anything written by Barbara Brown Taylor. Barbara Brown Taylor and Fred Buechner have this poetic way of conceiving of what preaching is and what it does. So if you're looking for a nuts and bolts book, so 2 books: The Preaching Life by Barbara Brown Taylor and Telling the Truth by Fred Buechner. When you read Telling the Truth, it feels a little bit like an acid trip because he's just real poetic and real weird and real mysterious. But if you've got the nuts and bolts, those are two books to read that kind of can revive you in terms of the purpose and the power of preaching and the beauty and the poetry of it. If you're a newer preacher and looking more for nuts and bolts, I'd say Thomas Long's The Witness of Preaching is a good nuts and bolts book. A friend of mine wrote a book, Jared Alcantara. What's it called? It's over here. The Practices of Christian Preaching. Kim, Korean-American homiletician, wrote a book called Preaching with Cultural Intelligence. So I'll give you a bunch of books, but those five are where I would start.
Okay. Speaking of books, I heard that you have a book coming out, I think, in the near future.
Yeah, it's a book for mainly for lay people, and for pastors who try to help lay people who are struggling with a spiritual slump. So the book's titled Overcoming the Spiritual Slump. What do you do when you don't want to pray or read the Bible and just sort of hit a spiritual wall? We talked about a preaching wall and a golf wall. What do you do when you hit a spiritual wall and you don't care? And you don't care that you don't care. And so I had that experience in midlife, sort of a spiritual midlife crisis. And I found in the life of David something very similar. And sort of the book is for people who are in some sort of slump, helping them get back on a streak again.
When does that come out, Lenny?
Comes out in June, we hope.
Okay. All right. We'll keep an eye on that. We'll announce that when it does. All right. We've got quite a few questions here. Are you good?
Yeah.
All right, great. I love using sermon series, but is there a specific time frame when congregations tend to drift off knowing what's happening next? For example, I once visited a service and a chaplain stood up and said, "We are going to spend the next 3 months on the Exodus." I saw the life leave their eyes.
Wow. I would probably shorten the span of that. So when I was in pastoral ministry, I would often do sort of a month textual series and then maybe a topical series next. And then, because thankfully we had a lot of new people coming into the life of the church, and I didn't want them to feel left out if they jump into week 10 of a 3-month Exodus series. So because we had new people coming so often, we didn't want them to feel lost. And so I would just shorten that, 4 weeks on colossal claims about Christ in Colossians, as opposed to Exodus. So yeah, but I do think there's something to be said about going through a book of the Bible, because when we do that, we're actually teaching our people how to read Scripture, study it on their own. And so that can be of great value, especially, as I said, in this sort of post-Christian, biblically illiterate context that we live in. It's a lot like the pre-Christian context of the first century. So we're back there.
Okay. All right, next question. Lenny, when balancing the heart, strength, mind, and soul languages, the 2 examples you gave suggested balancing all 4 in every sermon. How would you weigh the merits of that versus focusing more narrowly on one each week on rotation?
Beautiful. That's a great example. Great suggestion. So another thing you can do is, if you're doing a 4-week series, topical series, say on marriage, you can really focus in on week 1, focus in on the heart of the issue. Next week, dig into a text. And then next week, hit, sort of a theological reflection. And then week 4 will be more about sort of habits and practices that can get a couple healthy again in their marriage. So yeah, absolutely. You can structure a 4-week series hitting on one of those primarily each week.
Okay, great. How do you reach an audience that is all a lot older?
That was my first context. I was in my early 20s, a college senior, called to pastor a church of people who were like 125 years old. Like they had been living longer, 3 times longer than I'd been walking with the Lord, right? So I think it's really just a matter of spending time with them. How can I put the gospel in a container they can drink from? How can I get past the 22-year-old nose on my face to the needs of people in their 70s who can't wait to go be with Jesus, right? I was actually, while I was pastoring that church, I was a youth pastor at a different church. So I was preaching to teens who had their whole life ahead of them, and then preaching to seniors who had their whole life behind them. And so I think spending time with people, I know it's a lost art. It's pastor as CEO and leader and preacher, sort of 40 hours in my office, cloistered away, coming up with a talk. The best preachers are not the best talkers, they're the best listeners. They sit and they listen long and hard to the hopes and hurts of the particular people to whom they preach, so that when they stand up, they have something of substance to say that connects with those people. So spend time with your people. Jesus Christ came in the flesh and dwelt among us. So must the preacher.
Amen. Amen. All right, Lenny, why do you hate vinegar?
Adam, it is sickening. Vinegar is as sickening to me as the Dallas Cowboys.
Oh, ouch. A former Cowboys fan here. Sorry. All right. Don't you think when you allow people to help you preach your message in a way before the actual, it may water down the spirituality or Christ-centered message? Your focus may drift. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's why I started with theological substance. That's where the sermon prep starts. Having a word from God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So what does God want to say to my people is where I start every sermon. First of all, it usually starts devotionally. What does God want to say to me? How dare I let the word of God cut my people until the scalpel of God's word gets at my heart? So I want to have something of substance to say. And then I want to consider, though, how I can best say it in a way that's particular to my people. So to me, that's not a watering down. That's what Jesus did. Jesus wasn't just a prophetic truth teller who represented God to sinful people. He was also a grace-giving priest who represented people to God. So when I preach, I want people to say two things. Lenny walks with God and knows God, but Lenny knows what it's like to be me. Lenny has just articulated with words what I feel deep in my soul, but don't yet have words for. And that comes from getting to know your people really well. It's not a watering down. It's what Jesus did, right? Jesus came from the Father. John 1:14, Jesus came from the Father full of grace and truth. Humanity and divinity, grace and truth.
Wow. Good stuff. Good stuff. All right. Thank you so much, Lenny. How would you scale technique, voice, and approach? In other words, how would you adjust your approach based on the size or amount of listeners? What's your approach in that?
If I'm hearing the question right, I think it's about gesturing during delivery, using voice, face, body during delivery in a way that's sensitive to the context. That's the size of the space, the type of space, the kind of congregation, mainline, evangelical, low church, high church. Yeah, I think all of that has to matter. The rule of thumb is the bigger the room, the grander the gestures, the more variety in voice, right? So high, low, loud, soft, fast, slow, greater range based upon the size of the room. So if you're in a smaller setting, the voice variety might be not as rangy. That makes sense. I think that's the question. I think that's the question you're asking. Yeah, good question.
I think you hit it right on. Why is expository preaching essential?
I think all preaching is expository. That is, every preaching, whether it's a topical sermon, a textual sermon, should be expositional. That is, it should expose the meaning of God's word for people today. So I think where the question's coming from is expositional preaching as a style, but I think every sermon should expose scripture for people. But there is an expositional style that's more verse by verse. Some churches, some preachers only preach expositionally, verse by verse, phrase by phrase, word by word. And there's value in that for sure. But I like to go, personally, I like to go to a text, and there's about 1,000 sermons I could preach from that text, but I need to preach one this coming Sunday that intersects with the needs of my people. So what's the one word from the Lord I might take from this particular 10 verses that can preach this Sunday? That's expositional too. It's a different kind of exposition, but it's still expositional.
Thank you. What are some of the actions you took to recover when your risks did not pay off?
I think just to get back on the horse and keep trying. I mean, sometimes we can try to be too clever and cute, and take too many risks. And oftentimes, let's be honest, we take risks to impress people with who we are sometimes. At least I have. And those almost always backfire. But, when I take risks, sort of holy, God calculated risks for the glory of God, and I fail, I'm much better with that risk, because I did it for him. I wasn't trying to be too cute or clever. I was just trying to find a creative way to connect this biblical truth to the lives of my people. And it flopped, but that's okay. That's okay. I'll get back on the horse and try again. The problem is, over the course of preaching ministry, we get criticized. People say we're too shallow, or, we're too over their heads. We're boring, or we're trying too hard to entertain. And so we hear this over the course of our ministry. And if we're not careful, we can start to shrink and play our preaching safe. And that will kill the preaching soul. And that's why, one of the prayers I pray almost every time I go up to preach is, God, if I look like an idiot, but you're glorified, so be it. And that prayer has done wonders for my soul in terms of getting back on the creative horse after I've fallen off it.
Good for some more? We've got 3 or 4 more questions.
Sure.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Thank you for this. As a preacher who is also a stage actor, I have learned the hard way that preaching isn't acting. The problem for me is how to internalize to a point that I am not afraid to put down the paper. I heard the 25% rule, but is there anything else you could suggest?
Yeah. My pattern is writing out a full manuscript and then taking up to the preaching event with me just a one-sided sort of sheet of notes and flow. I spend a lot of time thinking about the flow of the sermon, the moves. So I don't think of the sermon anymore as 4,000 words I've got to internalize.
Okay.
I think of it more as 7 to 10 stones I have to step on to cross the sermonic stream. 7 moves. And I think I spend a lot of time with sermon forming those moves, because if I can get the movement of the sermon in my head and heart, I can get it internalized and speak it. Now, what you said about theatrics does matter, because, in a world that craves authenticity from leaders and speakers, if you come across as too theatrical, some people will shut you off. And yet preaching is high drama. So what I say to my students usually is, try to just be yourself, just be a little more of yourself in the preaching event. So if you're kind of a laid back, dry sense of humor person, just be a little more animated, not too much more, or then you'll look suspicious, right? You'll look inauthentic. Just be who you are. Get the sermon in you, look people in the eyes, and let the deep in you cry out to the deep in them, and just be yourself.
Wow. Good stuff. Wow. Okay. Who are some preachers you recommend listening to that embody these practices well?
Yeah, I like to listen to a wide cross section of preachers. Most of the time these days, I'm listening to my students who are very diverse, ecclesiologically diverse, different church traditions. I'll have a 23-year-old and then a 75-year-old preach in my class. I'll have black, white, brown, yellow. I mean, I have it all. And so I really learn a lot from a wide cross section of preachers. And I listen to mainliners, old school mainliners like Fred Craddock, who's passed, Eugene Lowry, the father of narrative preaching, Frank Thomas, Barbara Brown Taylor. These are more mainline folks. And then I listen to the sort of the staple evangelical folks like, T.D. Jakes and Andy Stanley and people like that. And my preacher, Steve Deneff, who's just a fantastic preacher. I get to sit under his preaching and enjoy it a ton. Christy, I want to add some other female preachers because I think there's some great female preachers out there who, because they're female in some circles, don't get a whole lot of press. But Christine Kane has a lot of passion. Teresa Fry Brown, African American preacher, really good. I forget her name. It'll come to me. Somebody else come to me, but if it comes, I'll let you know.
Okay. What are some helpful tips for team teaching, whether as part of a weekly rotating team or preaching as a team within a single sermon?
Yeah, like I said, if you can run your sermonic thoughts by a group of people who know the congregation well, and they can help you refine the sermon for Sunday, that's great. And so I can see a teaching team being of value that way. I got to be careful. I'm not super big on, like, if I'm the lead pastor of the mother church and there's campus ministries. I hope I don't step on people's toes. Just personally, like, the thought of me giving my sermon to campus pastors to preach doesn't sit well with me because I'm thinking about my context, the one I'm going to be live in. Mm-hmm. And I want the preachers on the team to be thinking about their context and let the context they're preaching in shape what they preach and how they preach it. So for me to impose my sermon on 5 contexts, 4 of which I'm not even at, clearly something's going to be lost in translation.
Dr. Lenny, are you a herald, pastoral, or storyteller/poet preacher?
I hope I'm all that the congregation needs me to be, right? So, if I've been more prophetic and heralding for this month-long series, I want to come across as more of a shepherd storyteller the next month. So as you look at your annual sermons, if you're always coming across as sort of the prophetic truth teller and never the priestly grace giver, something's wrong. And if you're always priestly grace giving and never prophetic truth telling, something's wrong. So I want to mix up my style from herald to prophet to priest to storyteller to shepherd, because Jesus was all those things. What does my congregation need today? Do they need shepherding? Do they need prophetic truth telling? Do they need a priest? Do they need a king to lead them somewhere? The needs of the congregation have to trump my preferred style, because that's what God did. He came in the flesh in a style. He trumped. Philippians 2. He made himself nothing, taking the form of a human. So he let the needs of humanity trump, in a sense, his preference for divinity.
Yeah. All right. One last question. Here we go. Video versus church preaching in the COVID world. How do we connect with online without a huge budget for video?
I have no idea. I was interim pastor at a local church here for about a year, and it was when COVID hit. So I resonate with the challenge, especially if you're a people person, especially if you live for the preaching event when you get to receive the sermon people are preaching back to you with their eyes. That's what I live for. I don't live for the study. I live for the preaching event. And so when you're preaching through a camera to a congregation, man, it's tough. Sorry for shamelessly promoting an article, but I wrote an article for Preaching Today titled Preaching Through a Camera to a Congregation During COVID, which has a bunch of sort of ideas for how to do that well, because it's not ideal. So let me refer you to that article, Preaching Today, type in my name, Preaching Through a Camera to a Congregation. Might be helpful.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Luchetti. This has been an incredible presentation, and your
Thank you all.
time here in the Q&A session, just great stuff. So thrilled with this webinar and so thankful to you for putting this on. I want to thank, like I said, Dr. Luchetti. I want to thank you for watching. We're doing this for you. We're doing this to help resource the local church. So thankful for you for joining us. And again, 10 small tweaks for big preaching impact, but we got 12 12 for the price of 10. So you can't beat that. Wonderful.
Can I offer a quick prayer, Joel, for my brothers and sisters online here?
Absolutely. Please.
I don't want to cut you off. You done?
No, are you kidding?
Lord, I pray for my sisters and brothers on the front lines, doing what you've called them to do in the place you've called them to do it. And we pray that you would multiply the bread and fish of their words so that they would become more than they ever would be without you in them. In the name of Christ, we pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you for that. I also want to thank Wesley Seminary for sponsoring this webinar. If you're feeling the call to seminary or you have your MDiv, you're thinking about your DMin, give us a call. We'd love to talk to you. Our incredible enrollment representatives can answer any questions, big or small, whatever they may be. Just call us 877-673-0009 or email us at wesley@endwest.edu or send Dr. Luchetti or myself an email and we'll get your questions to the right people. So thank you again for watching. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Hey, if you're available tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, join us on Facebook Live for our consecration service. We want to celebrate our graduates here at Wesley Seminary in this consecration service, and then they will actually graduate this Saturday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. So join us if you can. And remember, we are Wesley, and you belong here. Thanks for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.